Many people close to you and at a distance define you as the father of multicultural education. Do you resonate? Does that title resonate with you?
I always find it very humorous because, and that reminds me, I was being interviewed by a journalist in the United Kingdom, and she said, "Oh, I understand that you're the grandfather of multicultural education." I said, "I think you have it wrong. I think it's the father of." I always laugh about it. I find it humorous because there have been many people who've contributed, Sonia Nieto, Carl Grant, but I find it flattering but humorous, and thinking that whenever I'm told that, I like to help people understand that it was a much broader group than me. But
and you had a significant role bringing it to the light.
Yes.
Yes. You mentioned Dr. Carlos Cortez. He cites your leadership in pioneering, conceptualizing, and legitimizing the field of multicultural education as your most significant personal accomplishment. He believes that without you, multicultural education would not have become as much of a force for education reform that it has. Dr. Cortez also remembers teaching with you in Portland, where you introduced the concept of multicultural education to participants by using a short version of The Three Little Pigs. He describes the lesson as being as masterful as it was unexpected. What was the analogy?
You know, it's very funny that he remembers that better than me. The only thing I can think, I must have been talking about persistence, and because if you remember in the Three Little Pigs, the one pig used straw to build his house, but that the pig that really succeeded was the one that used bricks. Mm-hmm. And so he was persistent and courageous and staying with the task. That's the only thing I can think about that I probably had in mind.
Recalling from that memory.
Right, that one has to be persistent, one to stay with the task. Because the pig who used papers and straws didn't really persist. They played around, and therefore their house got blown down.
Sure.
Paper and straw. But if you really, the pig who made the bricks and constructed a brick house, the wolf wasn't able to blow his house down. So he was really persistent. That's the only thing I can think.
There's the analogy.
Yeah.
Your colleague and friend, Dr. Sonia Nieto, whom you also mentioned, describes you as one of the consequential theorists in the field of diversity, from defining the term to developing a typology of multicultural education, as well as the dimensions of multicultural education. What are the dimensions of multicultural education?
Well, the 5 dimensions, and let me just talk a little bit about how the dimensions evolved. They evolved because when I did many workshops across the nation and for teachers. And teachers would often tell me, particularly math and science teachers, that multicultural education is fine for social studies or for literature, but it really has almost nothing to do with me. And so I would say things like, okay, why did that happen? Well, I think one of the reasons it happened is that most of us who were the pioneers in multicultural education, such as myself, Geneva Gay, Sonia Nieto, Carlos Cortez, that we're all social scientists. And so that we had created models and conceptions that the social studies and literature teachers could easily relate to. But the science teachers would say science is science, or math is math. And so I began to think that we needed to develop some kind of conceptualization where teachers, particularly in science and math, could see multicultural as having meaning for them. And it came to head at a workshop that I was doing at a very fancy private school, and I can't call the name of the school. It's a high school in the East Coast that has a huge campus. You can imagine what it looks like. Those private residential schools on the East Coast that have acres and also residences for students. I was doing a workshop there. I was told to come in. Sonia Nieto and I were invited to come in to multiculturalize the teachers for a day. And of course the teachers were very tired. They arrived at the workshop at 3 p.m, and we were supposed to multiculturalize them. For one day is all we had. And one teacher, I think he was a science teacher, was very arrogant. By the way, I'm Southern, so I like for people to be polite. And this teacher, after I finished my lecture, was very arrogant and dismissive and said, multicultural, I'm a science teacher, and multicultural has nothing to do with me. And he walked out. And I thought, wow, was I angry. But you know, flying home that night, I thought the role of a scholar isn't to be angry. The role of a scholar is to think about what that teacher said. And he said that multicultural to him was not meaningful because he was a science teacher. So we need to develop a conceptual framework that will help him think about multicultural beyond content integration. So that's when and it was on the plane that I began to develop this conceptual scheme that would help teachers from all disciplines understand that multicultural wasn't just about content. So I developed the dimensions, and there are 5 of them. The first one is content integration, where you take content and put it into the curriculum. But the other dimension, so that's the dimension that can be difficult for a science teacher, although you can put, black scientists in the curriculum. But that really isn't really the heart of what I was talking about. The next dimension is called knowledge construction. And scientists deal with that very much, of how is knowledge constructed and who constructs it. And if we look at that knowledge is constructed, is influenced by people, by the questions they ask. How does who you are or your environment influence the question that you ask? And you deal with that in all disciplines. And so that's the second dimension. Another dimension is equity pedagogy. That is creating strategies that enable kids from diverse groups to achieve. And that the science teacher, notice that the science teacher has to deal with knowledge construction, has to do with equity pedagogy, and then the next dimension is prejudice reduction. How do we create classrooms that reduce prejudice so that all kids can experience civic equality? And then, so that's a dimension that all teachers deal with. And then the 5th dimension is empowering school culture, and that all teachers have to deal with that. I mean, I could go into more detail, but that's the rough sketch. That, in other words, if you go down this line of the 5 dimensions, more and more teachers can come into it.
Sure.
At each one of them.
You're giving them a conceptual framework to think about this.
To think about this.
Sure. That makes sense. Drawing upon this work, what school reforms are still needed to improve the experiences of students in these areas in schools?
Well, it's a process. We still, African American boys and Latino boys are still among the kids that are put into special ed classes disproportionately. They're disciplined disproportionately. They drop out disproportionately. The President Obama has just announced an initiative to help men of color achieve and succeed. So there are many problems of the tremendous achievement gap between mainstream white students and poor students and African American Latino students. So that all of that is the issue that keeps me going. We still have very few African American teachers entering the profession. We still have a very few. We have many more African American women in college than men. So these are the issues that are still before us, and there are many. And we still have even the content in the curriculum, even though we made tremendous progress since the 1960s, it's still, even when we put blacks and Latinos in textbooks, it's still looked at primarily from a mainstream perspective. So there's much work left ahead.
So addressing these issues are part leading to the solutions.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's continuous because the ideal of equality, you never totally attain it. You may attain it 90% for one group, but then there's another group.
Your colleague and friend, Dr. Ellen Schoenfeld, notes as well that you have devoted your career to issues of equity and multicultural education. He cites the Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education, which you co-edited with your wife, Dr. Cherry Banks, as a testimony to your influence and the impact of BIO's work. Tell us about this project and the impetus behind it.
Yeah, the Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education. That's a very interesting project that we undertook. I think the first edition was published in 1995. And that were handbooks of teaching and handbooks of math in various disciplines. And we thought that it was time to really legitimize the field. And one of the ways that we were legitimizing different disciplines was with a handbook of research. And we thought that the time had come to put a handbook together for multicultural education in order to legitimize it. I mean, we're still struggling for legitimacy in this new discipline. And one of the ways you do it is to bring the research together. So that the major goal of that project was to bring the research together so that it could help legitimize the field, and also so that it could be in libraries and used as a textbook. And I had never thought of using it as a textbook until I was visiting Stanford. And my colleague, Armando Padilla, who teaches at Stanford, said, "Jim, I'm using your handbook as a textbook." I said, "Oh, you are? I never thought of doing that." So now I've been using it in one of my seminars since Armando Padilla told me he was using it. So it was really to bring the research together and to legitimize the field, and to let people know that multicultural education is a legitimate discipline that has research, and enough research to put in a handbook. And we brought together, and it was quite influential.
So it was a grounding event. You grounded it for educators. Your friend and colleague, Dr. Zeus Leonardo, describes your numerous accomplishments, awards, and accolades, but cites among your most significant accomplishments the fact that your name and multiculturalism go together. As one of the founders of a relatively new subdiscipline in education, you have opened space for a whole new generation of scholars who make it their preoccupation to promote diversity in both schools and knowledge production. He adds that it is not diversity in the sense only of adding previously neglected populations and their perspective into the mix and stirring the pot, but diversity in the sense of transforming the entire enterprise of education itself. What work is needed next in this area?
Well, I think the notion of transformation still needs to continue, because if you look at our own College of Education, for example, we are still have several African Americans on the faculty, several other ethnic groups of color. So part of that transformation is bringing in people with different perspectives. And I think part of the transformation is to rethink the ways that we train teachers. We're still training teachers in ways that are not transformative by and large. We need to think about looking at not just adding ethnic content to the curriculum, but putting in perspectives and points of view that challenge the existing socioeconomic structure, the existing institutions. So we need to really transform in a way that will bring in global perspectives, that will bring in perspectives of people who've been outside the system. So it's really a continuing process of rethinking. I'll give an example of the westward movement. We still find in schools this notion of the westward movement. I mean, and Carlos Cortez raises the question of who was moving west? I mean, the Indians weren't moving west. They were already in the West. So what is the westward movement? And what is meant by the westward movement? Westward to whom? It wasn't westward for the Native Americans. It was their home. It wasn't westward for the Mexicans. It was north. It wasn't westward for the Alaskans. It was south. And it wasn't westward for the Japanese. It was east. So I think we need to, these notions like westward movement, illegal immigrants. What's an illegal immigrant? I think that we need to really interrogate those kind of notions. And that's what I mean by transformation, is to really come up with different perspectives of looking at the world, different perspectives from looking at the movement of people, and to rethink what America is and what the world is. And I use that westward example, the westward movement example, that we still find in textbook as that epitomizes what I'm talking about.
So most of the work in the multicultural education has been in the K-12 arena. Is that correct, or is there some higher education
Oh, there's
implications
much
here?
higher education.
Talk about
work.
those a
Yeah,
little bit.
there's a lot of, it started with ethnic studies and women's studies, and there has been powerful work, and in some ways, the work in higher education is ahead of the K-12 because for many complicated reasons, it's easier to change a college curriculum than a K-12 curriculum. It was the ethnic studies movement in colleges and universities that really gave the impetus for the movement in K-12. So yeah, the Black studies programs, Mexican American studies program, women's studies, gay studies. Oh yes, these have been really extremely important in changing the university curriculum. And I would say that the university curriculum has made greater strides in change, at least in terms of the departments.
Sure.
It may not be in the mainstream required course, but that has been tremendous work. Sandra Harding, Ron Takaki in ethnic studies, the ethnic studies department, the women's studies departments, the gay studies programs, those have been extremely important in influencing my work and my drawing up on those of us in K-12 drawing up on that work.
And does K-12 have something to learn from higher ed?
They have a lot to learn from higher ed, but it takes about 20 years for it to get from higher ed to the classroom for a lot of complicated reasons. It's just harder to change schools.
Sure.
And it's harder to get, and it's harder for teachers to get the information. And so we have a lot to learn about changing perspectives, about the depiction of different groups, about the interaction of different groups. But it's easier for a university professor to change his course than a teacher to change a 12th grade social studies program.